Aloha kakahiaka. My name is Deborah Ward. I joined the Mauna Kea Management Board's Environment Committee back in the year 2000 when I was a faculty member at the Natural Resources and Environmental Management Department at the university. Since I retired, I'm currently serving as chair of Sierra Club for the Hawaii Island. The reason that I'm here today is that I generally support the work that's being done to decommission the CSO site, but I believe that the assertions with regard to groundwater and permeability of the cinder and the direction in which the groundwater goes and where it ends up is very, very confused. I've tried to ask Dr. Thomas to provide me with recent studies, and I have not gotten any answer for that. The reason that I'm concerned is that there were French drains in the CSO with unlined cesspools, an unlined cesspool, and chemicals have been noted at the bottom of that drain. It's been 34 years of operation. We really don't know what else has been poured or flushed down those drains. There was a hydraulic oil release in May 2009 that resulted in excavation of contaminated soil below the slab, but it looks like there's going to be more of it. There were about 3,500 feet of soil removed, but they feel that they would have to do additional investigation and cleanup when the observatory is decommissioned. But some of the concern I have has to do with how the university characterizes where the water goes. In the DLNR documents provided in the application, it says that it goes to groundwater, but the groundwater is not drinkable, not potable. The application to the Department of Health with regard to the NPDES for the 30-meter telescope says that surface runoff runs to the recreational streams, and that it doesn't go to groundwater. This document, the Phase 1 Environmental Site Assessment, says that the groundwater status is reported currently used for drinking water. The shallow aquifer is classified as high-level, uncontained, perched aquifer occurring in an impermeable formation. And then the groundwater is further described as irreplaceable with a high vulnerability for contamination. This is a study by Mink and Lau in 1993, and is potentially used for drinking water. And that the groundwater is described as irreplaceable with moderate vulnerability to contamination. So we've got 22.7 gallons of hydraulic oil that is run down through the French drain into the soil. Some of it's been removed, some couldn't be removed. There are still stains on the concrete, so it's hard to know what else was spilled and the extent of the spill. So our concern is that the contaminated soil be cleaned, and that it be investigated to the fullest depth of the contamination, so that we know how we can characterize what that permeability is in that site. And we are well aware that the hydrology is extremely complex, but we know very little more about it than that. And so I would like to know how one can access the most recent studies, if there are further studies that we don't know about. Thank you very much.
Aloha mai, everybody. I'm Hanalei Ferguson. I'm the spokesperson for Nakapuna Moku Keawe. I would like to request that an extension be given at least 30 days to go through a lot of the documentation. You know, you have to understand that we're not the University of Hawaii, so we don't necessarily know what you're doing all the time. But we're finding it little by little, stuff that you've done, like the report from the Enron or whatever the name is. But I haven't had a chance to really go through it really clearly, and I think it'd be really important to be able to. But there's other considerations that I don't think has been considered, and that's the cultural spot of it. From the fact that it's above Lake Waiau and next to Poliau, there are a lot of things that could be happening there. There's no doubt that there's technology already available that can help contain possible things like the oil spills, the drifting of the oil and stuff like that. It's really just a matter of money. But that being said, I still like to be able to review these documents and see how legitimate I think they are. One of the problems I think is, and it's been mentioned several times, is that this is not the state of Hawaii. And we can argue about this all day, and until somebody can prove to me that it is by way of treaty, then I have to assume that you guys don't have it. That being said, we still have to work together somehow. So if you would allow a 30-day extension on this action item, that would give us, at least us, a chance to be able to review some of these studies that were done. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Fritz Klassner, for the record, Natural Resource Program Manager. So the Phase 1 environmental site assessment for Caltech Submillimetre Observatory decommissioning, the 2010 decommissioning plan spells out the decommissioning process, and including preparation of a site decommissioning plan, which consists of 4 major steps. This might have been helpful to have before this, but the first is a notice of intent. The second is an environmental due diligence. The third is a site deconstruction and removal plan. The fourth is a site restoration plan. Each of those steps gets approved by, or document sets gets approved by this board. This board approved Caltech Submillimetre's Observatory's notice of intent, I think in 2016. At the same meeting, it deferred on Hokukeam. So anyway, here we are now where we have the CSO's environmental due diligence phase 1 report. Because the phase 1, the purpose of a due diligence process is to identify recognized environmental conditions defined by the American Society for Testing and Materials with the project site. And by that, they are referring to the presence or likely presence of hazardous substances or petroleum products on the property that indicate a release, past release, or threat of a release, or any other hazardous substance or petroleum products, that kind of thing. There's 2 main steps. One is a phase 1 site assessment to review the legal terms, and if anything is identified in that phase 1 site assessment, then a phase 2 assessment is typically required. That basically is additional investigation to determine what needs to happen, if anything. This phase 1 site assessment did identify and I think it was well known before this had ever happened, or the site assessment came out. It was included in the notice of intent that there was a hydraulic oil spill in 2009, as well as a possible prior spill at an unknown date, perhaps during construction of the report. This report recommends a phase 2 assessment, meaning this report is recommending additional investigation during the site deconstruction and removal process. That process and reporting process is governed by Department of Health rules, EPA rules, so it's fairly well defined how that process works that we have to follow. It would be detailed in the environmental assessment for Hokuke'a, or for Caltech Submillimetre Observatory decommissioning, and this phase 1 environmental site assessment, as all of the elements of the site decommissioning plan, are envisioned to be appendices in the environmental assessment for Hokuke'a. So they'll be out there for public review at multiple stages as we move through the decommissioning process for Caltech Submillimetre Observatory. So with that, by approving, I think the simple explanation is we'd be saying we're asking Caltech to do additional investigation during their facility removal process.
So in other words, conduct the phase 2.
Correct.
So Fritz, exactly when would the phase 2 be done?
Because of the location of the spill that was identified, when the 2009 spill occurred went into a floor drain in the middle of the building. They dug out what they could. They tested. I believe Ms. Ward referenced that before. So the reason they didn't complete that process in 2009 is to dig out all that material. They were worried about undermining the foundation. So as they break up the foundation, they'd have to test. So
yes,
the process would be spelled out in the environmental assessment, but the actual implementation can't occur until you start breaking up the foundation.
Okay.
Is it reasonable to establish a deadline for phase 2?
Any deadline for phase 2 would be tied to the actual foundation removal process. It does, the challenge in it all becomes, depending on what they find, they may need to prepare what's referred to as a remedial action plan. That's so there's an element of this that involves working closely with Department of Health through the removal process, so that depending on what's found, Department of Health is aware. Everybody can we can draft that action plan if needed in a timely manner. It's still, the way the decommissioning plan is written, it still needs to come back to this board, potentially be approved by DLNR, by the Board of Regents. So yeah.
It's a long process.
Yeah, it's more of a process. The deadlines,
What I can tell you is there are conversations at the board level relative to setting deadlines. And I would encourage action at this level to look at establishing deadlines. And I think it would be good to be proactive in that way instead of having some timelines placed from a higher level that would be difficult.
understood.
Question, is the telescope still in that building?
Yes, the CSO mirror is still in place.
So they have to take that out first before you affect the foundation, right?
Yeah, and dismantle the dome, the structure above that as well.
Just a comment, Wayne. I think, as I understand it, Fritz, there's the notice of intent, there's environmental due diligence, which is what we're reviewing. The phase 1 is what we're reviewing now, but there's still the site deconstruction and removal plan and restoration plans, right?
And environmental assessment process,
Right.
and a board-issued conservation district use permit to do anything substantive on the ground, which
Right.
is subject to all the time issues of a board-issued conservation district use permit, as TMT can well attest to.
So is there a projected timeline for applying for the CDP?
At the moment, the last version I saw had it in sometime in 2020. So I mean, we have yet to release a draft environmental assessment,
Right.
and that has legally mandated public comment times. And then the CDUA process has legally mandated public comment times as well. So, yeah.
Okay.
Are we ready to vote? Okay, all in favor of approving the Caltech Submillimetre Observatory Decommissioning Phase 1 Environment Site Assessment? All in favor say aye. Aye. Unanimous approval. Okay. Move to the next item, approval of the Caltech Submillimetre Observatory Decommissioning Hazardous Material Report.
So as a companion to the Phase 1 environmental site assessment, the formal title of the report is Asbestos, Lead Paint, and Mold Survey, hazardous materials for short. But basically, this is a standard and a required part of demolishing a building in any kind of instance. So this survey was conducted to identify if anything is present, and if so, the extent of hazardous materials, that information can be incorporated into the design of the decommissioning process, and the results will inform the process and help us determine what abatement permits need to be obtained and some of the procedures that followed during the site deconstruction process, the actual planning and then the implementation of that plan. This report will also be an appendix in the environmental assessment, so it'll be out there and available for public comment on multiple occasions again in the future. In brief, the survey documented there was no asbestos-containing material with detectable concentrations found, which is sort of a standard detectable, what the lab can detect. There were 6 different locations with surfaces painted with lead-based paint, meaning the concentration of lead was in excess of 5,000 milligrams per kilogram. There were 7 locations identified as having surfaces painted with lead-containing paint, meaning less than 5,000 milligrams per kilogram. So basically, they have lead paint issues that they'll need to address. There were no airborne fungal concentrations detected inside the building. They're different than outside, meaning there was no airborne mold present. They did notice some mold in ceiling tiles, so there are some mold issues that just clean up the ceiling tiles separately. So in brief, the recommendations from this report are, follow the regulations regarding hazardous materials and regulated materials. There's state and federal law, disposal requirements that go with this. The process of removing the building or removing the infrastructure with the lead-containing and lead-based paint includes removing the loose material first, spot treating areas that are going to be affected during the deconstruction process so that you don't inadvertently make things airborne. There's a variety of health and safety statutes that need to be followed. There's airborne monitoring for lead during the removal process so that there's testing to make sure that if any lead starts to get released, that they can stop work and fix it. There's also soils testing pre and post in the surrounding area before deconstruction to document if there is any lead in the soil, and then afterwards to determine if anything was released into the environment, that it could be addressed if so, or demonstrate that it was not. Otherwise, there wasn't a recommendation per se with this, with either of these reports. It was just how we will. That we had reviewed both of these reports with the community groups, and that how we will respond if the report is approved or disapproved. But basically, this would also be incorporated into the site deconstruction and removal plan.
So really, because these areas of lead paint have been identified, then it will need to be dealt with based on standard protocol that Department of Health has established, right?
Yeah, correct. So the first step with decommissioning is a hazardous material abatement before they ever really start taking the building down. There's some hazardous material work, and then until all that material is gone, there's some extra precautions that need to be taken.
Any questions?
And the issue regarding the potential additional testing for water mitigation, that's going to be done or included in this hazardous plan?
For water?
For the drainage that Ms. Ward brought up.
Oh, I think did I forget to mention, so as part of the phase 1 community consultation, so in the phase 1 report during the community consultations, I forget where the comment came from, but someone was asked both about the cesspool sludge, to determine if there were any potential contaminants with cesspool sludge. So with whether you think of it in the hazardous material or the phase 2 investigation, that cesspool sludge would also be tested for contamination, as well as there'd be testing with underneath the foundation. There's no near surface groundwater at this site. However, at the phase 2 report, there was a cover letter that identified that the surface groundwater that was referred to in the body of the report was actually about 10,000 feet down. That they had a clarification in their cover letter.